I still remember the sound of the crickets in that field near Kursk. It's funny. When people talk about that battle, everyone imagines only the thunder of the guns, the roar of engines, the cries of men. But, on that specific dawn, before anything started, what stuck in my memory was the annoying, stubborn sound of the crickets in the tall grass, as if the war had nothing to do with them. I'd been with the Soviets for weeks, helping keep alive some tanks that had come through the supply route. Half of them were scrap metal disguised as war machines. The other half was only still standing out of stubbornness and duct tape, and a bit of faith. I was the foreigner there, the American who messed with engines like a farmer fixing a tractor, and no one really knew whether to laugh at me or thank me. That day, the heat was already heavy, even before the sun had fully risen. The smell of burnt oil, grease, and gasoline mixed with dry earth and sweat. My hands were black with grime and my coveralls stuck to my body. And right there in front of me was the problem. A T-34 limping like an old horse. It had taken a hit days before near the transmission. Nothing pretty, nothing fatal, until we saw the real damage. The hull was intact, but part of the axle and a set of bearings had cracked in an ugly way. The tank could still move, but every meter was a groan of metal. If we were in the United States, it would be officially out of action. In theory, there was no way to fix that in the field. In theory. The Soviet commander, a skinny fellow with sunken eyes, called something like Ivan. Everyone seemed to be named Ivan over there. Came up to me, breathing hard. He pointed at the tank, then at the horizon, where smoke had already been rising for days, a constant reminder that the Germans were preparing something big. NATO. Very important, he said, mixing some Russian words with broken English someone had taught him God knows where. This tank must fight. He put his hand on his chest, then pointed at the other tanks lined up, some with peeling paint, others with improvised replacement plates. I didn't understand everything, but I understood enough. They were counting that T-34 as part of the defensive line. On paper, it was a number. In practice, it was a busted wreck propped up on stands with an American sweating over it, trying to pull off a miracle. I thought of Mary. Right then, she would probably be taking Tommy to school and trying to hold Grace's hand, who surely insisted on running everywhere. I thought of her hands washing dishes, the radio on talking about battles with difficult names, and her trying to imagine where I was on that huge world map. If she knew I was there, swatting a fly from my face and staring at a crippled Soviet tank, I think she'd cry from anger. I took a deep breath, ran my hand over my forehead, spreading more grease than wiping away sweat, and looked at the damage again. There was no way to fix it properly, that I knew. But it was possible to try a patch job. I didn't call it that, of course. To me it was improvising. To the Soviets, it was niet problema, davai. It was all the same thing. Taking pieces of things that were never meant to go together and making it look like it had been planned from the start. If you look fast enough, you'd swear it was original. I started rummaging through the scrap pile. I found a part from an old American truck, a slightly bent axle nobody wanted anymore, some bearings still intact, a sheet of metal that could be cut and adapted. The Soviet welder, a short, quiet guy, came closer with the equipment hanging off his shoulder. He looked at me, I looked at him, and neither of us needed to say anything. We just pointed, measured with tape, marked with chalk. It was absurd. I was taking parts from a cargo truck to make a battle tank last one more day, in any manual that would be forbidden. But there was no manual there. There was only the smoke-filled horizon and the information passed from mouth to mouth. The Germans were coming. With everything. With panthers, tigers, Stukas screaming from the sky. And on our side, a bunch of tired men, a handful of tanks, and an American who fancied himself a farm mechanic. While we worked, the distant artillery started to rumble. First like thunder very far away, then closer. The ground trembled slightly, as if the earth had chills. One of the young soldiers, who always showed up to watch the American, stopped next to me, lit a cigarette with a trembling hand, and asked in broken English, "Will work?" It wasn't a technical question. It wasn't about torque, pressure, wear. It was something else. I knew that because I felt the weight of it land right in the middle of my chest. I wasn't sure. Nothing there gave me certainty. If the patch job failed in the middle of battle, that tank wouldn't just stop. It would die under fire and along with it 3 or 4 men. If it worked, maybe they'd have a chance to come back alive. That was it. I was bolting my stubbornness and my conscience into a hunk of metal that would soon be surrounded by explosions. I tightened the bolts as best I could and asked the welder to reinforce the welds. I took a strip of leather from an old belt, cut it, adapted it as an improvised shock absorber. I used wire where I shouldn't, hit things with a hammer where it wasn't ideal, and prayed in silence as I put it all together. Yes, I prayed. It wasn't a pretty, proper prayer. It wasn't church stuff, hymns, or open Bibles. It was just one thought repeated in my head. Hold, please, hold. Just today. Just now. I didn't ask to kill Germans. I didn't ask for glorious victory. I asked for my patch job to hold and bring those men back. Just that. When we finished, the sun was already burning overhead. I called the tank driver, a broad-faced guy with a crooked smile. He climbed up, went in through the hatch, started the engine. The T-34 woke with a rough roar. I felt every vibration in the ground as if there were bolts connecting it to my own stomach. Slow, I shouted, waving my hands. He started moving. 1, 2, 3 meters. The sound of the transmission changed, but it didn't break. The tank made a short loop, limping a bit, but moving. I crouched down, trying to hear any strange noise. There was a creak here, a hiss there, but nothing that announced immediate death. The commander came over and gave me a hard slap on the shoulder that almost knocked me over. In his eyes, that was a miracle. In mine, it was a patch with an expiration date. That's when the world fell apart. German artillery began the real attack. First, a long whistle in the air, then the impact. The ground jumped under my feet, a wave of dust rose. Another one, 2, 3 impacts, now closer. Alarms started blaring, men running. Shouts in Russian that I already understood without needing to translate. Positions! Hurry! The tanks started to move. A line of T-34s rolled forward, kicking up dust, engines bellowing like animals heading to a slaughterhouse. Among them, my crippled one, my patch job, my mechanical sin. I stood there, my dirty hands hanging at my sides, and felt a weight climb up my throat. I wanted to run up to them, drag everyone out, and say, "Forget this tank, it doesn't deserve you." But they wouldn't even have understood. And even if they had, they wouldn't get out. More explosions. Planes appeared in the sky, but I only saw bits of them, cut out between smoke and flashes. Some dove, letting out horrible sirens. Stukas, someone said beside me. I just heard the metallic scream in the air and thought of Tommy covering his ears if he heard that. The T-34 passed about 20 meters from me. I could see the freshly welded mark on the side, the plate we'd adapted to protect the weak spot. The driver waved quickly from the hatch. The commander raised his binoculars. And then they headed toward what the world would eventually call the greatest tank battle in history. I stayed there, praying quietly, as if my words could reach the metal inside. We always said machines had no soul. Maybe that's true. But that day, I swear it felt like a piece of me had gone along with that engine, with that old American truck axle, with that improvised leather holding everything in place. I can't say how much time passed. When the first reports began to come back, of destroyed tanks, of lines advancing and retreating, of men burned inside steel shells, I was looking for only one thing, someone talking about that crippled T-34. In the middle of the chaos, one of the soldiers came to me, covered in soot, his eyes red. He spoke too fast in Russian, pointing to the distant field, then made a gesture with his hand imitating an explosion, then another gesture of the tank still moving forward. I didn't understand all the words, but I understood what mattered. He had seen my tank keep fighting even after taking hits. It had held. My patch job had held, at least for a while. I sat on an empty ammo crate, my hands shaking, and laughed. Not a happy laugh, but a nervous, almost hysterical one. Because in the end, it all came down to this. The lives of several men hanging on parts that were never supposed to be there together. And me, an American mechanic in the middle of Russia, praying that tired bolts and reused metal would bear the weight of the world. That night, when I finally managed to lie down in a corner of the tent, the distant rumble of artillery still echoing, I thought again of Mary, Tommy, and Grace. And I realized that, there in Kursk, I wasn't just fixing tanks. I was bargaining with God using a wrench and scrap metal. I spent the whole night listening to the ground tremble. It wasn't my imagination. Every distant impact made the earth vibrate as if it had a heart of its own. That's how it was in Kursk. You slept, or tried to, already knowing that at any moment the ground could shudder and remind you that there were hundreds of tanks clashing out there like metal beasts. I woke up every few minutes, not knowing if it was because of the explosions or the anxiety. That crippled T-34 wouldn't leave my mind. I saw the weld shining under the sun, the improvised axle, the leather strap, and I imagined each piece creaking under the weight of battle. It was like listening to your own heart from afar, and not being able to do anything. It was still early dawn when a young soldier burst into the tent, breathless. He was shouting something I only understood when he grabbed my arm and yanked me outside. The attack hadn't stopped. In fact, it was worse. As soon as I stepped out from under the canvas, I smelled burnt powder mixed with churned-up earth and hot oil. The sky, still dark, flashed with artificial lightning from the front. Each flash lit up the field like a black-and-white photograph. Freezing for a second, the image of men running, vehicles lining up, makeshift ambulances carrying wounded men in silence. Some groaned. Others no longer had the strength for that. That sight always hit me like a punch. The contrast between desperate movement and the silence of some faces. It was war in its rawest form. The Soviet colonel, the only one who spoke enough English to give me orders, came up to me out of nowhere, his face covered in soot and sweat. "Turner," he pointed toward the rear. "We have tanks coming back. Many. We need all mechanics." I swallowed hard. I knew what that meant. If they were coming back, either they were damaged, or they were empty inside. I walked quickly with the other mechanics. Morning light still hadn't beaten the smoke when the first T-34s began returning. Some were dragging themselves, belching black smoke, armor plates hanging like torn scales. Others had huge holes in the hull, pieces of unexploded ordnance lodged in their guts. And then I saw it. My crippled T-34, or what was left of it. It approached slowly over the hill, leaning to one side like a wounded animal dragging its own carcass. There were impact marks on the side, deep gouges, scorched paint. The plate I had improvised was crooked, holding on by a thread. But it was alive, and coming back. I felt the air trapped in my lungs until the tank stopped in front of me. The hatch opened with a groan. The commander came out first. His face was covered in dried blood, not his from the looks of it, and his hands were shaking. He climbed down, leaned against the hull, and when he looked at me, smiling as if he'd found a long-lost brother, I felt my knees go weak. "It worked," he said, his voice cracking. "Turner, it worked." The driver came out right after, coughing. With his quick move, I could see that part of the inside of the tank was scorched. Another hit had struck the flank, but the patch had deflected part of the impact. It wasn't supposed to be possible. It wasn't supposed to have held, but it had. Even so, one man was missing. The gunner. The commander noticed my look and lowered his eyes. He stayed, back there. That hurt more than any explosion, because no matter how well my adaptation had worked, there was no way to save everyone. Sometimes, not even a whole tank could save a single man. And that was the part of war no one taught you, the cruel math, where every life lost took pieces of those who remained along with it. Even so, the driver and the commander were alive, partly thanks to the tank, partly thanks to the patch, partly thanks to something bigger than any tool. And I felt a huge weight inside my chest. Not pride, not relief, something in between, something confused. A mechanic doesn't save lives, at least not in the heroic way they talk about in the newspapers. We just try to keep men from dying too fast. That's the truth. We started working on the T-34 right away. The damage was bad. The side armor was almost detached. The improvised axle had held, but it was at its limit, creaking like a bone about to snap. Inside, the smell of smoke and death still clung to the hot air. I swallowed the bitterness and focused on the job. "Can you fix it?" the colonel asked, coming closer. I assessed the tank, ran my hand over the old weld, touched the truck part I had wedged in there, listened to the pops from the transmission. I wanted to say yes. I wanted to offer hope. But hope given wrongly gets men killed. I can try, I answered at last, but it won't survive another battle like this. The colonel nodded slowly. He knew the answer before he heard it. The tank commander came closer to me, still pale, still trembling. If you can make it move, just one more time. That just one more time kept echoing in my head. It was always like that. Always one more request. Always one more tank that needed to live past its deadline. Always a handful of men counting on the engine not dying before they did. I worked the rest of the day. My hands shook with exhaustion. The heat was unbearable. My throat felt dry as dust. But I kept going. I cut a new plate, adapted another part, made a new reinforced weld. Not because I thought the tank would survive one more assault, but because those men needed to believe they could. Every hammer blow was a different prayer. Every falling spark was a silent plea. And the whole time the booms of the battle echoed in the background, reminding us the world could collapse at any second. When I finished, the sun was setting, dyeing everything red. Red like fresh blood. Red like the embers of a war that never went out. The commander came to me again. He didn't say anything. He just put his hand on my shoulder, firmly, like someone trying to thank you when words aren't enough. All I could answer with was a tired nod. That night, before falling asleep, I heard again distant explosions and the creak of vehicles being rushed around. The murmur of the soldiers, the muffled sob of a wounded man, the wind passing through the twisted metal of a destroyed tank. And then I realized something bitter but true. Fixing machines was easy. Fixing men was hard. And the next day, I knew that crippled T-34, and all of us, would be put to the test again. I woke before dawn, not knowing if I had actually slept or just blacked out from exhaustion. The tent was cold despite the Russian summer heat, and the smell of smoke seeped in through every gap, reminding me that the night hadn't been quiet for anyone. I went outside, rubbing my face, and saw the silhouettes of the tanks taking shape in the dim light. Some were intact. Others looked like charred ghosts of machines that had been alive only hours earlier. War didn't wait for anyone. It always called early. My crippled T-34 was there, stopped, quiet, as if it knew the day was waiting for the final test. The reinforced weld from the night before still shone where I'd run the torch. The new plate was crooked but firm. The improvised axle, well, that was another story. I knew it was at its limit, a limit that hadn't been made for war. The commander came up to me, with deep dark circles under his eyes and a heavy expression. The driver walked beside him, limping a little, but alive. Every step they took looked like it had been torn from the ground, as if gravity had doubled since yesterday. "Turner," the commander said, taking a deep breath. "Today, we need to go farther." I looked at the tank and then at the horizon, where gray smoke mixed with blue sky. It was always farther, always just one more time. And each time, we lost someone. "If it moves, it fights," I replied, adjusting my gloves. But it wasn't built to survive another day like this. The commander nodded. None of us were. For a second, we weren't soldier and mechanic. We were just two tired men trying to survive the logic of an upside-down world. We tested the engine, and it started with a low, uneven, but stubborn growl. It sounded like an old man getting out of bed, complaining about every joint. The driver revved it twice. The tank shuddered and moved, slowly, heavily, but alive. I stepped back a few paces and signaled with my hand. It was ready, or as ready as it could be. It was no longer a complete machine. It was a mosaic of borrowed parts, improvisations, and half-resolved faith. And that day, faith was all we had. As the sun began to rise, the men formed up. German artillery opened fire first, always them, always starting the day by reminding us they had enough iron to bury the world. The ground shook, dust rose, shells marked the earth like furious fingers pointing at who was supposed to die. The crippled T-34 advanced. I walked behind it for a few meters, watching every creak, every jump in the suspension. It was like watching a sick child try to run. Something inside me clenched with every meter it moved. Then the first impact came. Not on it, but close. An explosion tore up the ground a few meters from the tank column. Men dove to the earth. I instinctively dropped down and felt the wave of heat pass over me. The T-34 kept going anyway, as if ignoring that the world was coming apart around it. The second impact came even closer. The ground flew. Fragments slammed into the tank's hull. The commander, half his body out of the hatch, shouted orders. A piece of shrapnel sliced his arm, but he kept yelling as if he hadn't even noticed. The tank swung to the right flank and started a slight climb. There, I knew, was the final test. The improvised axle had been creaking since early on. That kind of incline was exactly what usually made any patch job give out. I got up, feeling the adrenaline hit hard, and walked to where I could still see them without becoming an easy target. I swallowed hard. The T-34 climbed. 1 meter, 2, 3. The engine roared, the transmission groaned, and the whole hull vibrated like it was about to come apart. Then it happened. I heard the snap before I saw it. A dry, sharp, metallic crack, the sound of something important giving way. The improvised axle had finally reached its limit. The side drive sprocket tilted at a strange angle, and the tank lost power for a second. Come on, please," I muttered, as if my words could push that hunk of metal forward. But this was no longer a repair job. It was fate. A third impact landed close enough to throw a shower of rocks and dirt over me. When the dust settled, the T-34 was still there, but stopped. The side had given out. The patch job had broken. The tank couldn't move anymore. The Germans intensified their attack, and the tanks around it pushed on ahead, leaving my crippled one behind. It wasn't cowardice. It was orders. It was war. A dead machine couldn't become an obstacle. I saw the commander climb out of the hatch, waving to the ones going on, like a captain saying goodbye to a ship he already knew was condemned. The driver came out below him, clutching the arm he'd injured the day before. They ran to a nearby ditch while the hull stayed exposed. For a moment, the world went silent. Just for a moment. Then the final impact came. An explosion hit the crippled T-34 from the side, right where I had improvised the parts. The tank turned into fire, air, and metal. The heat wave hit my face like a slap. When the smoke rose, only a charred skeleton was left where, just hours earlier, there had been hope on tracks. I felt my legs go soft. I sat on the ground, exhausted, and stared at the flames with a terrible sense of defeat, as if I had lost a friend. The commander dragged himself over to me, filthy with earth, still bleeding. He sat down beside me, panting, staring at what was left of the tank. He took us. "Far enough," he said, his voice tight. "Far enough." Those words struck deep. I thought of every bolt tightened, of every weld laid down, of every prayer whispered at the tank's side. And then I realized a bitter truth. No machine in that war was made to last. Neither were any of us. The crippled tank had gone beyond what was possible. It had saved 2 men. It had done more than any manual would demand. And it had died, the way those who never should have been there die, fighting with what they have. We stayed silent for a while. When the colonel came to get us, saying the battle wasn't over yet, the commander got up slowly and looked at me. "You did not save a tank, Turner," he said. "You saved lives." I wanted to believe it. Maybe it was true. Maybe not. But at that moment, it was enough for me to stand up and move on. That night, writing a few crooked words on a piece of paper I meant to send to Mary, I realized something I had never fully understood. War isn't made of the tanks that advance, but of the men who try to fix what's left. And that day, I fixed what I could, and left the rest in God's hands. Thank you for staying with this memory to the end. If you want another story, another lost chapter from those hard years, I'm here to remember and to tell. O ChatGPT Podcometer Eros. Confira informações importantes. Consulte as prefere.